Welcome to Chax Poetry Talks, a podcast brought to you by Chax Press. This is Charles Alexander. I'm your host and speaker. You can find Chax Press online at chax.org. And now, the podcast. Hello, and welcome to the first podcast in the Chax poem series. This is a series that I have thought about creating for the past several months, and with the help of Chax assistant David Weiss, it is now beginning. My name is Charles Alexander, and I will be coming to you on a fairly regular, we hope weekly basis to present some glimpses of poetry from some of the earliest poems created on the planet, or at least the early ones that have survived, to some of the most recent poems created on the planet. Why am I doing this? One, because I love it. Two, because it's more difficult to reach people right now in a time of coronavirus pandemic quarantining. However, that was not the spark that made me want to start this series. I think I have something to offer, and from my 30 or 40 years of studies in poetry, practice as a poet, work in college, in graduate school, in directing Chax Press, a contemporary poetry publisher, in making contacts in the last year and a half in China with poets there who will be represented in this series, and in being generally a community builder and activity builder in the world of poetry in the United States and beyond. My own books are out there in the world for you to find, and I hope at some point to read some from them too. But this is not primarily about my own creative work as points of view, hopefully specific ones, on some poems, poets, issues in poetry, problems in poetry, movements in poetry, etc. I thought I would start just by posing the question, what is a poem, which many people have tried to answer, from definitions ranging from syllables juxtaposed in beauty to a poem. Well, actually, this was a book should be a ball of light in one's hands. That's an Ezra Pound definition. I particularly like the complexity of what William Wordsworth has to say about it in his preface to Lyrical Ballads. Lyrical Ballads was first published in 1978. It was a book by two poets, William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. The preface was published in an edition just a little bit later in 1800, where Wordsworth wanted to explain a little more about what he was doing in poetry. And the definitions he gives in that essay are multiple and complex, but I want to boil them down a little bit to one kind of formula or process which he talks about, which both gets at the creation of a poem and I think what makes it a poem, and the process of running that creation all the way through to the reader and the reaction by the reader. Wordsworth says that poetry is spontaneous overflow of emotion. And many people stop right there. That does sound like a romantic, with a capital R, definition of poetry, and certainly Wordsworth is one of the leading poets of the Romantic movement. However, he doesn't stop there, and we shouldn't either. because he clarifies that spontaneous overflow of emotion as it moves toward poem by saying the overflow of emotion is recollected in tranquility. Recollected is an important word, as is tranquility. Recollected is not quite the same thing as remembered. It is recollected. In a certain way, it is the poet's mental capacity, emotional capacity, that is not only recollecting the experience that occasions the poem, but re-inhabiting that experience. And in doing so, passing it on to the reader. Now, it's recollected in tranquility. That doesn't necessarily mean the writing takes place in a place or position of tranquility, because Wordsworth goes even farther and he says, as the writer makes this recollection, she or he experiences the overflow again and is allowed to write the poem so that it is invested with this emotional, spiritual sense, and that is carried over to the reader, who then experiences that. This is enacted beautifully in Wordsworth's poem lines while looking at Tintern Abbey, where he speaks of being in a way overcome by the powers of nature, learning to keep that sense of being overcome inside himself, and also to pass it on in terms of the poem, within the poem, to his sister as an experience that she can have, but also through the poem as an experience that we can all have. And so this is about a poem about the mind, and about the mind's rapture with the natural world, and about the importance of the purpose of passing such experiences on. If you haven't read Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey poem, I strongly recommend it. There are other definitions of poetry, some of which seem a little bit more offhanded, but it doesn't make them any less serious. I think of Emily Dickinson, most of whose poems are written in the 1860s, many during the American Civil War, who talks about, in a letter, the effect of a poem in knowing something that is a poem when it takes her head off, or when it makes her feel as if her head has been taken off. Now, that's an extreme statement, and I don't think she means anything like having a lobotomy. I think she means having her mind changed, having her eyes opened up, having something entirely unexpected happen. This, in some ways, relates to an experience in psychoanalysis, of the uncanny, according to Freud, in which we have moments that can't be explained by what we currently know. So we have to find some other way. Our mind has to find some other way. So our mind is opened, it is expanded. The poet H.D., or Hilda Doolittle, in the early 20th century, spoke about her so-called jellyfish moments. And to her, these were, we think of maybe jellyfish as moving, trembling, shaking a bit, having a difference of absolute clarity, as though something is confused. But in her mind, out of such confusion arises new possibilities. And I think that's what poetry does for us. It gives us new ways of looking at the world, new ways of looking at our life in this world. It gives us the news, which both means that which is new and also that which might be useful. William Carlos Williams, the American poet, one of the finest American poets ever, and certainly in the 20th century, wrote in a brief statement that people say you cannot get the news from poetry, but I know men who die every day for lack of what is found there. So if you want to think about poetry as having a purpose, I don't know that you can give it, a number 1, number 2, number 3 outlined bullet point specific purpose, but that one of keeping us open to new possibilities and new experience is very high up on the list. I want to read another poem. Well, I think I'll just talk about it. Robert Creeley has a poem called The Warning, in which he says, for love I would split open your head and put a candle in it. And that would be also almost an amulet, a gemstone. And you can imagine that also seems fairly extreme. And yet he's talking about the same thing. He's talking about the spirit of creating a poem. The spirit of love is the spirit of saying, here is something that will make you think differently. Here is something that will open you up. Here is something that I think you need. Here is something that introduces the possible, and it's going to be a possible that you had not yet considered. And I think that happens for the poet, often for characters or the addressee of poems, and certainly for the reader. It doesn't, however, happen all the time. As much as you might want to bring your poet-ready readership to such work, it's not always easy to do. There is a Chinese poet in the Tang Dynasty period, which is to some the classic period of Chinese poetry, Wang Wei. Wang Wei is probably one of the 3 poets most would place among the most important poets of that period, along with Li Bai and Du Fu. However, it's not a competition, and that was a period of many really amazing poets. But in Wang Wei, we find also an opening of the mind to expansive possibilities, but without that, taking a head off or splitting one open to put a candle in. It is, I don't know if I would call it more tranquil, but he's almost writing from the position as though one just opens one's eyes and that opening of the mind has already happened. For example, and some of these poems are very short. In reply to Bei Di, the cold river spreads boundless away. Autumn rains darken azure deep skies. You ask about whole South Mountain. Mind knows far beyond white clouds. I want to read that once more. The cold river spreads boundless away. Autumn rains darken azure deep skies. You ask about whole South Mountain. Mind knows far beyond white clouds. I think what the mind knows is everything. And most of us don't realize that it is possible to know everything in this way of feeling a part of everything. So something is giving way. The cold river spreads boundless away, yet that's part of the world we are in too. Something occasions a difference in sight. Autumn rains darken azure deep skies. And someone asks about the whole South Mountain, which seems like that's a question of geography and landscape, but Wang Wei turns it into a question of the openness of the mind. Mind knows far beyond white clouds. I'll do one more by Wang Wei, which is rather beyond knowing. And this is a part of a series of poems he wrote having to do with his retreat, Wheel Rim River retreat in the mountains, where he spent much time, particularly later in life, and where he was buried. And this is called Bamboo Clarity Mountains. Tall bamboo blaze in meandering emptiness, kingfisher greens rippling stream water blue. On autumn pitch mountain paths they flaunt darkness, woodcutters there beyond knowing. What we know is beyond knowing. The mountain paths are beyond knowing. The meandering emptiness is what we are in and leads us to a sense of being in it, just that. I think maybe showing that poetry doesn't have to do a lot, although it does a lot, and not in not trying for too much, or does a lot if it just lets itself be. The Wang Wei poems, I should say, are from the Classical Chinese Poetry Anthology, which is translated and edited by David Hinton and was published by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. Okay, I'm going to be coming to you in subsequent weeks. I know in about a week we're going to have Walt Whitman's birthday, which should be an American celebration, and we'll talk a little bit about Walt Whitman. And I have ideas for some other poems having to do with approaches to nature and where the poet might posit herself within the natural world. But we will have all kinds of things, from nights prickling down plains to such jellyfish moments as I mentioned, to proprioception, one's sense of oneself and one's place in the geographical world. Thank you for listening to this first episode. Again, this is Charles Alexander. Goodbye.